Hello, so this is the first of my 3 paper preparation presentations, just to basically give a little bit of a last minute overview of what to expect on paper 1, go through a few key concepts that I think are going to be really important. But the main reason is that after 2 years of teaching this course and trying to reinforce certain messages, I want to make sure that the kind of last voice that's heard before you go into the exam is the same messages that you've been taught for the last 2 years. Obviously you're on study leave now, you're doing your own thing, your own revision, and that'll probably be for the most part focused on things like content. So I want to make sure that you still know the basics about how to structure your exam questions and your answers and what to expect with the papers, and then just go through some key revision. You know, this paper covers 2 themes, so there's obviously going to be links between the 2, so I just want to make sure that you're prepared for those links as best as you possibly can be, and maybe some examples of how the links between theme 1 and the market and the people sides of the business can be related to a global scale. So first of all, we need to know what to expect when we open the paper. So to say this is the same for paper 1 and for paper 2. So we've got a 2-hour paper, we've got 100 marks. All 3 papers are 2 hours and 100 marks, but the way the paper 3 is structured is slightly different. But one thing that you will see is in paper 1 and paper 2, you'll see 2 sections, both with 50 marks, 2 4-markers, a 10-marker, a 12-marker and a 20-marker. So since there are 2 sections in 2 hours, my advice would be to try and aim and complete 1 section in each hour. Try and think of it as 2 separate exam papers. That'll just make it so much easier to focus on your timing when you know that after an hour of the paper you should have done the first section. You should have got 50 marks with the questions completed. We've tried to stick to this over the last 2 years and try to spend a mark a minute, or maybe just slightly more than a mark a minute. If you work at a mark a minute, then you've got 50 marks in 60 minutes, so you've got about 10 minutes to spare in each section. You'll spend some of that on the case studies, which I'll talk about in a few seconds, but you'll probably find that you need a little bit of extra time for the 10 and 12 markers. I think the 4 markers, if you know the calculations, and the 4-mark explain questions are fairly straightforward. If you know what you're talking about, they don't take 4 minutes to answer. And the 20 marker as well, 20 minutes is more than enough time to make your 2 arguments and make a detailed justification for the choice that you make. But it's those 10 markers and the 12 markers that tend to be a little bit more of a struggle. It tends to be a little bit tighter because you have to write 3 decent paragraphs in 10 or 12 minutes. So try and use, just be aware you've got that extra 10 minutes there that you might find you need for those 10 and 12 markers. But some of that time is also going to be spent looking at the case studies. So you get 2 sets of extracts, 1 for each section. So obviously the questions on section B are only talking about the businesses and the extracts and the small extracts in section B. So by the time you get to section B, you want to make sure that section A is finished. That's a separate half of the paper. You don't want to be referring to any of those businesses or any of those, don't use any of those quotes in section B. So stick to the extracts from that section. So you want to consider how you're going to approach the case studies, and I think this is something that's very personal for students. Some students will try and read the entire set of case studies first, and then maybe read the questions, or read the questions and then read all of the different extracts. One thing that we've worked on over the last 6 months that I think some students might find a bit easier to help narrow down what you've got to look for in those extracts and which extracts to look at is reading the questions and trying to identify which extracts or which sections of an extract are likely to be linked to each question in that section. So say, for example, if the section A 10 marker is about human resources in Morrison's or Tesco, then if extract C is about the human resources in Morrison's or Tesco, you'll know that extract C is where you want to be getting your supporting data for that 10 marker. So just annotate that so that you've identified that. So it just means that when you get to the start of the 10 marker, rather than having to read through the whole case, the whole extract, the whole series of extracts again to find the bit that's relevant, you can just look at the bit you've already sort of highlighted, and it might make it a little bit easier to just pick out the application. And obviously, if you want good answers, if you want to get a C grade on any question, if you want to get above half marks on any question, you need to make sure you've got application to the business in the question. So just consider how you're going to approach the case studies before you go in. Make sure that decision's already been made before you go into the exam. And then once you get in there, you've got 4 different types of questions to contend with. So you have 4 markers, you'll have 4 of those, and then 2 each of 10 markers, 12 markers, and 20 markers. So these are the structures that we've looked at over the last 2 years. It's not the only way of answering the questions, of course, but I think it covers all of the sort of the key ingredients you need to have a good standard answer. Students last year were very successful with it, so we'll go with the whole if it's not broke, don't fix it mentality. So the first set of questions are the 4 markers. You're more likely to find that some of these are going to be calculation questions, and obviously 10% of the entire set of marks for the paper, so at least 10 marks on the paper, should come around being able to use quantitative data, so using numbers and data. That could be in a 10 or 12 marker or a 20 marker, where the question would say, using the data and extract, whatever extract it is, maybe it has a data table, maybe it's more likely to be in paper 2, a statement of financial position or something like that. You might see some reference to data in there. With this being paper 4, maybe that's going to be things like GDP data for different markets, different global markets, such as GDP per capita or GDP growth rates or something like that. But you're also quite likely to see some 4-mark calculation questions. So they could be calculation questions. Think about things like labour turnover, things like that, or income elasticity or price elasticity of demand, or it could be supply and demand curves. So have a look through your notes for theme 1 in particular. There's quite a few calculations in there. Try and identify what kind of calculations could come up. But be aware, it's not going to be as straightforward as calculate the price elasticity of this product. It's going to require you to maybe rearrange the equations or work out the percentage change in quantity or percentage change in income based on data that's in the question. You might see some supply and demand curves as well, so just make sure you can identify whether the change in the question or in the extract is going to have an impact on supply or demand, and whether it's going to increase supply and the willingness of a business to supply that product, or if it's going to have an impact on demand, so the willingness of a consumer or ability of a consumer to purchase it. So those are the numeric side of the 4 markers. The other type of 4 marker you might get, and are likely to get, at least one of them, will be a question that's framed as explain how. So you don't want to write a whole paragraph for this, you don't want to write a whole peach paragraph, but what you do want to do is you want to make sure that you define whatever key term is in the question, you make your point clear using the words of the question, and then you talk about the effect that it has on the business, and make sure you use the case study. You have to use the case study, but what you don't need in a 4 marker, you don't need any counterbalance. So you don't need a however, you don't need to consider any other perspectives, you just need that one paragraph. And the key thing is, as long as you've made a good point, the key thing is that you've used the case study or you've used the context of the business to make sure that your answer is applied to that business from that question. That's really important in those 4 markers. It's the difference between getting 2 out of 4 where you've maybe made a good point but it's not relevant to that business, or it's not clearly linked to that business, and getting a 4 mark out of 4 answer. We've also got 10 markers. So the 10 markers and 12 markers tend to be framed fairly similarly. So you might see a question such as assess the likely impact of something on a business, or assess the importance. So with both of these 10 and 12 markers, you want to make sure that you've got a definition of whatever the key term is at the start. There should be a clear key term in the question. It should be one of the parts of the question. And then you want to have your 2 paragraphs. So if it's assess the impact, then you probably would want to go for something like it may have a positive impact, and then the second paragraph, maybe it might have a negative impact, it might have a big impact, or it might have a very small impact or no impact. If it's about the importance, paragraph 1 should be this, whatever the key term is really important to this business because. The second paragraph, it's not important because, and maybe that's because there's something else that you can infer from the case study, or something else that is more important than the topic that the key term is on. So you might have a question that says assess the importance of a promotional strategy to a certain business. Your first paragraph would be reasons why you think that promotional strategy or whatever promotional tactic they're using is really important. Your second paragraph might be you might bring in something else. You might say that something else is more important. So, for example, for a business like a low-cost producer like Aldi or Lidl, your second paragraph might be an argument that actually promotional strategies aren't important to them because they get their unique selling point. They get their differentiating feature from having really low prices. And so actually maybe the pricing strategies and the way they position themselves within their market might be the more important factor. So the key thing with these 10 and 12 markers is that they have to be balanced. So if it's about the impact, it has to consider both sides of the argument. And what you will then need at the end is you'll need to have a conclusion where you use the words of the question. Make sure you do use the words of the question. So if it is, assess the importance of a promotional tactic or promotional strategy, your conclusion should start with that. It should start in conclusion. I believe that the promotional strategies are important or are not important to this business because, and then you pick what you think is your strongest point, or maybe the point that you can justify the most, or the point that you think is the most significant, and justify it. Basically, that's all you need to do, and you can't be wrong as long as you justify it with a reasonable argument that makes sense for that business. It has to obviously be related to the context of that business. So make sure you make your point really clear. Make sure you talk about the effect that this has on the business. And this effect could be something like it might have an impact on revenue, it might have an impact on profit margins, it might have an impact on costs, it might have an impact on motivation or morale or something like that. Make sure you apply it to the context. So you have to I would always advise to use direct quotes because I think it makes it easier for the examiner to see that you have taken something from the case study and you've understood what the case study is telling you about that business. And then make sure you've got balance by providing a however. So if you're arguing about a promotional strategy, for example, your however could be talking about the cost of implementing it, maybe just something to just show the examiner that you've got an awareness that the point that you're making is not a perfect point. There actually is some counterbalance to it. So especially in those 10 and 12 markers, you should get balance just by having 2 paragraphs that argue the contrasting perspectives. But there's no harm in just chucking a however point at the end of those paragraphs as well. So the difference between a 10 and 12 marker is in terms of the level 4 mark. So this is the higher end of the mark band. So this is the sort of 9 to 12 marks. You need to have a bit more depth in your analysis and your conclusion to get in the 12 marker compared to the 10 marker. I've kind of told my students to write to the same real standard because I think they should be aiming to have that level of depth in their analysis and their conclusions for their 10 markers as well. But just be aware that that's why you get the extra marks. The extra marks on a 12 marker compared to a 10 marker come at the top end of the mark band. So it's level 3 and level 4 marks rather than level 1 and level 2. The last set of questions that you're going to get 2 20 markers, and I think structurally, these are probably the easiest questions to answer because what they tend to do is give you 2 options, and it's your job to make a recommendation about which option should be followed through. So first of all, you'll have your definition. You might have 2 definitions. Maybe if it's 2 options, maybe 2 different theories. One question that we've worked on in the past was that question using Aldi and whether they should focus on their customer experience or keeping their prices competitive. So for paragraph 1, you would want to have a for and against option 1. Now you can do that as a peach paragraph if that's what you're comfortable with, but the however needs to be significantly more detailed. What you don't want to have is an argument that says they should do this. These are the reasons why option 1 is a good idea. And then another paragraph where it says these are the reasons why option 2 is a good idea, and then base your conclusion just on the positives, because actually there might be really significant negative points to one of those arguments, and that might be the thing that swings the decision in that option's favour or against that option. So make sure you've got a for and against that are in a level of detail. So you should have an argument, yet option 1 is the right option based on what the question's asking for. Maybe it's focusing on improving profits, maybe it's improving market share. Make sure your answer is linked to the words of the question. You might say that option 1 is the best, but you need to have your argument. Option 1 is the most suitable option because. However, there are downsides to option 1, and these downsides are. And then the same for paragraph 2. So effectively what you want is 4 paragraphs. You want for and against option 1, that should be 2 paragraphs or 1 very detailed paragraph. And then your second option You need a for and an against for that as well. You must have a conclusion. If you don't have a conclusion on the 20 marker, you aren't actually making your recommendation. All you're doing is analysing it. And this question starts with effectively evaluating and recommending. So if you don't have your conclusion with your recommendation, you aren't really completely answering the question. So you need to make sure that you provide that recommendation, and providing, like same goes for the 10 and 12 markers, in your conclusion, as long as you justify what you're doing, as long as you justify the decision that you've made, you can't be wrong. You can't be penalised for picking, maybe the examiner believes option 2 is better, but if you've made a compelling and reasonable argument for option 1, you can't be marked down for that. You just have to be able to show the exam skills. You have to be able to show that you can justify your points. I think with these A-level papers, it's probably 50-50 in terms of what you need to know in terms of knowledge and what you need to be able to demonstrate in terms of exam skills. And if you want to be able to demonstrate what you've learned in the right way, you need to tick certain boxes that an examiner is going to have in their mind when they're reading your answers. They're looking for certain things. And those things are, they're obviously looking for well-argued points, but they're also looking for points that are applied to the case study. They're also looking for conclusions. They're also looking for counterbalance. So hopefully if you follow the structures that I've set out, you should hopefully hit all of those boxes, providing you make the right points. So paper 1 covers theme 1 and theme 4. So I've put a list on the screen of the headings for the different units that are in theme 1 and theme 4. What I've done is, I did this as a revision session for my year 13s during the half-term holiday, and I just went through a couple of different links between theme 1 and theme 4, some areas where I think it's much easier to link theme 1 content to theme 4 content. So obviously theme 1 is based heavily on the marketing and the human resources functional areas of a business. Theme 4 is all about global business, but you can see that 4.3 is about global marketing, so there's a clear link between theme 1 and theme 4 in there. So I identified 3 different areas that I thought were pretty clear links. So the first that we're going to have a look at is market and strategy on a global scale. Then we're going to have a look at people management on a global scale and the differences in those global labour markets. And then a little bit about ethics as well, because there's a lot of ethical consideration. I know ethics is a theme 3 topic, but ethics comes up quite significantly in theme 4 as well. So I think it's worth looking at the ethics in managing people and looking at the ethics in marketing, especially how that is different when you start working on a global scale. So the first area we're going to have a look at is the differences between ethnocentric, polycentric and geocentric marketing approaches. So this is all about the different strategies that a business uses when they take products into new markets. So the idea is that any business moving to a new market is going to use one of these 3 approaches. So first of all, we need to know the difference between the 3. So ethnocentric is you put a lot of stake in your home market and what you've developed in your home market. So you sort of have this belief that your approach will carry over into any market. So for British businesses, this tends to be the case for a lot of brands that are built around being British. So you think about businesses like Burberry, for example, is a very historic British brand. Jaguar and the Land Rover, those products are part of their identity is about being British, and so therefore the people making those marketing decisions, they believe that will make their products popular in other markets, and that tends to be the case a little bit more towards for those businesses that are a bit more of a luxury brand, and therefore the idea is that rich people and people with high levels of income in different countries tend to want the same luxury products. So those businesses have been very successful in other markets by effectively taking the same marketing approach. Now remember, when we're talking about marketing, we're talking about the market mix. We're talking about product, price, place and promotion. So an ethnocentric perspective would tend to favour the idea that their products are going to be successful in different markets the way they are in their current market. The opposite of that is a polycentric approach. So this is where you adapt your marketing approach for every market. This is probably more likely to be the case where there's less differentiation and less of a unique selling point. So therefore, Burberry changing their branding is going to go against the image of that product, and so therefore maybe they devalue their brand or devalue the product that they're selling if they change it too much. Whereas a lot of businesses maybe in the middle of the market or at the sort of more low cost end of the market, if you follow Porter's generic strategies, they might find it easier to change and adapt their price, their product, their promotion tactics and their distribution for different markets. So what you tend to find is a lot of the big businesses will go for the more geocentric approach, which is the idea is that this is a bit of more of a mixed approach. So if they can take certain things over to new markets and keep them the same, that's obviously going to be beneficial, because if you have to adapt your marketing operations and your marketing strategy, for different markets, then perhaps that means you're going to change the product, in which case you're going to have to increase your unit costs because you're going to have to change the way you manufacture it, or maybe you lose out on some economies of scale that you were previously benefiting from. But they will also have to adapt into certain areas. So I've got on the next slide, I'll give a little bit of an example of a prominent global brand that has done that. They've made small changes to their product, to their product and to their market and mix, to make their product a little bit more successful, a little bit more accessible to a foreign market. So we've got these 3 different marketing strategies, but all of them are based around, and this is obviously a theme for topic, but all of these are based around changing parts of the market and mix. So when we think about a business entering a new global market, they've got to decide on which combination of the market and mix will be suitable for any new market. So you think about product, price, place and promotion. Coca-Cola is the example I referred to a few seconds ago. So they tend to adopt a geocentric approach. They're not going to change the taste of Coke too drastically. It's such a powerful brand. It's known everywhere around the world. Such a familiar logo, such a familiar colour set, such a familiar taste, such a familiar, the packaging and everything like that. They're not going to want to change that too drastically, but they have to be aware of where differences are in different cultures. So for example, when they moved into India, consumers in India drink fizzy drinks in a much smaller volume than they do in the UK and in Europe. So they changed their product slightly to make their package, to sell it in smaller quantities. So they make smaller bottles, smaller cans. They also will adapt the price depending on the affluency of the market they're going to. If they're going to certainly in the developing economies, they're not necessarily going to charge the high price that they would charge in the UK, where incomes are a little bit higher. So they will adapt parts of their market and mix, but not all of it. They'll try and maintain the benefits that they get from being such a prominent brand. So any business must decide when they're entering a new market whether they need to change any of their parts of their market and mix. And some businesses might not have to. Some businesses might be able to take it as it is into a new market. And if so, that's going to be great for them because it's going to be really easy. They're not going to have to spend a huge amount of money on research and money on adapting their product and their offering. But a geocentric approach tends to be what the majority of the big businesses are doing. They also have to be aware of differences in terms of tastes and trends and cultures. So this is going to have it's going to make a significant difference in marketing decisions when you choose elements of your market and mix. Another example with Coca-Cola is the way consumers in certain markets purchase their food and drink. So a lot of Coca-Cola sales will come from groceries, the grocery market, and in certain countries, whereas in the UK we tend to get most of our grocery shopping from the big supermarkets. We kind of go there, we want to try and find everything under one roof. Whereas in other markets, especially over in Asia and the Middle East, they tend to buy their groceries from smaller convenience store kind of shops, and so therefore the distribution is going to be different. Whereas Coca-Cola in the UK, they will sell to those, but the majority of their distribution will go to these big supermarkets and bars and restaurants. In different countries, that's going to be a little bit different, so they need to make sure they're aware of that. In terms of the differences in tastes and trends, it seems to be that it's less of a factor when it comes to high differentiation businesses, especially luxury products. The power of the brand and the desire for that brand means that, as I mentioned earlier, the people who have large incomes in different countries tend to want the same luxury products. The luxury nature of the product makes it desirable in any market. So you think about something like a Ferrari or a Porsche, or the really high-end luxury clothing brands like Gucci, etc. consumers in different countries, they still want those brands, and they want them to be the same brands that you would get in the other countries, because part of the desire of having them is people knowing that that's a Ferrari, and so therefore if you change the product, it would lose its brand appeal. So that's about global marketing strategy, and how marketing strategy tends to be changing when businesses operate in different countries. The next thing to consider is looking at people management. So people management is obviously the other half of theme 1, and there are some significant differences in global labour markets. The first 3 areas that I'm going to have a look at are, we've got to consider differences in terms of skill from different countries, wage rates in different countries, and things like literacy levels and educational standards and HDI. Obviously, in the UK, our sort of home market, we've got high levels of skill, we've got high levels of education. Everyone is in educational training until 18 years old, and therefore we have a fairly high skilled labour market. What that means is the people who work in the UK who have high skills will tend to demand high levels of wage rates. When businesses move to different labour markets, so for example, and I'll mention outsourcing and offshoring in a moment, when they move their operations to a different country and therefore hire staff from a different country, the skill levels are obviously different, and therefore the wage rates are obviously different, and sometimes that's the main reason these businesses make these decisions. They're obviously driven by their desire to make high profits and to maintain profit margins and keep shareholders happy. And one of the easiest ways to reduce costs is to look at your wage rates, and if you can employ someone in a different country at a far lower wage rate to do effectively the same job, you're going to do that if profits aren't particularly high, if profit margins are slim, or if you're under pressure from your shareholders to get high profit levels. The question from there is there a trade-off between wanting high standards in terms of what you expect from your employees and having low labour rates in terms of wages? There probably is, and a business that makes the decision to employ staff from abroad or move into a different country, they're going to have to consider some of the factors when it comes to moving their labour abroad. Are they going to have to have high investment in training to make sure that the new staff can meet higher standards? Or are they going to have to accept that actually quality of service might decrease a little bit, or quality of manufacture might decrease a little bit due to the skill shortages in certain areas and certain labour markets around the world? So that's obviously going to be a big consideration for them. Literacy levels are obviously really important, and education standards. Even secondary industry jobs in manufacturing are going to require a certain level of literacy in order to be able to follow health and safety instructions and to follow assembly instructions and to just follow protocol. So literacy levels rising across the world, and especially in these developing economies, is going to be something that's really important for businesses to consider. Now, in terms of recruitment and selection, there are obviously differences in recruitment and selection when you go into different markets, different global markets. Firstly, in terms of legal procedures and requirements, things like minimum wage rates, things like discrimination, legislation. So that's going to have to be something that businesses are going to have to consider, and it's their responsibility. If they're moving into a different market, they need to make sure that they are aware of the requirements in that market and they're able to meet them. Now, the two main ways that businesses tend to do this, tend to move into global scales, obviously the first one is through expansion, where just through growth they start to target new markets and therefore employ people in those markets. But what is quite common is the idea of outsourcing and offshoring production. So the difference between the two, as you can see on the screen, outsourcing is where you pay another company to do the work for you. So you pay another company. Maybe this is to run your customer service operations, maybe this is to run your manufacturing. You pay the company to do that job for you. You have no real involvement other than treating them as a supplier, basically. And then you've got offshoring as well, which is more where you move the operations abroad, but you do it yourself. So, a common example of this, especially local to where we are, is we've got the BT centre a few miles away. BT have done this. They've offshored their call centres. They've offshored them to different markets, and in doing that, they've taken advantage of a number of different factors that are going to make it much cheaper for them and therefore increase their profit margins. wage rates are obviously significantly lower. They also have lower investment cost in terms of building, in terms of tax regulations as well. So they do this to save themselves money, but obviously there is an impact there, maybe as mentioned earlier, on the level of service that you get and the quality, and the trade-off between having lower paid staff should, you would assume, result in lower quality. So is there a bit of a trade-off there in terms of what they get back? So just a couple of things to think about when it comes to recruitment and selection and people management. It's important to make sure that you're aware that people management is different in different global markets, and that links quite heavily to the start of theme 4, where they talk about potential markets as a production location, or potential markets, potential countries as a market. So whether you're selling something there or whether you're just using it as a area to produce or to create output, it's going to be something that you're going to have to quite strongly consider. The last thing I want to have a look at is when we think about ethics in global business, and I want to specifically focus on ethics in marketing and labour. Marketing approaches and cultural differences are going to have a significant impact on the way a business is able to market their products. So we've seen plenty of examples, we've covered a few examples this year, where the attitudes towards things like alcohol are different. So you can't advertise alcohol in certain areas. Maybe this is because of a religious belief, or maybe this is just a cultural issue, a cultural difference. There's also different approaches towards animals. So we looked at a case study where there was an advert that had a dog in it, which was a family pet, obviously, because in the majority of, certainly Western Europe, you've got dogs used as household pets, whereas in some areas of the world they're looked at as street pests. So therefore those advertisements, those promotional materials would not fit in with the different markets where they view dogs as sort of wild animals. There's also examples of businesses that have had adverts that maybe have been based on a beach, or I think there was a beach volleyball advert, I can't remember the company that it was, and you've got people in bikinis playing beach volleyball, and in certain countries, in terms of like how conservative they are about their dress and their standards in terms of how much skin should be on show, they find those adverts aren't appropriate in those countries. So a business needs to make sure that they're aware of cultural differences in different countries when they're making their decisions in terms of what marketing they're gonna do. The last thing to have a look at is labour practices. So what we need to be aware of is that, first of all, standards in developing economies are lower. So we've got things like sweatshops and trial labour that we know takes place in different markets where the legal requirements are different, and there's an argument that this might make it difficult for a business that is global, that operates in so many different countries. Is it fair to expect them to know the different legal requirements in every single market? I think it's fair to say that if they're going to operate in a different country, I think it's fair to expect them to do their research and make sure they know what legal requirements are there. And as we've mentioned before, that trade-off, that concept of the trade-off between profit and fair treatment of workers, businesses are obviously primarily aiming to make high levels of profit and therefore pay high levels of dividends to their shareholders who've invested in them, and to allow reinvestment and growth in their future and their growth as a business. And in doing that, quite often we see examples of businesses. Primark's a pretty good example of this, where there's a lot of questions about the ethics of how they treat their staff. Amazon have been caught up in this. Apple have been caught up in this recently as well. There's a lot of businesses that have had questions asked about how they treat their workers in terms of working standards, working conditions, and in terms of pay. So to what extent does that trade-off exist, where businesses maybe focus a bit too much on profit and not enough on the fair treatment of workers? Now ultimately, this is going to come down to the impact that this has on their reputation. So Primark have struggled with this over the last 10 years or so. Apple and Amazon are obviously getting a lot of negative press and a lot of pressure from media outlets and from consumers to act a bit more ethically in the way they treat their staff. Ultimately, what's going to make their decision for them is going to be the impact on their revenue. So if consumers feel that strongly about it, maybe what they need to do is stop buying products from those places. But when you can buy 3 t-shirts for £4 in Primark, you can see why consumers continue to go there. So consider the impact of ethics on labour practice and ethics on marketing as well. I know that the paper 3 is the one that's based around the global confectionery market, but we've seen a lot of examples this year of where ethics in terms of marketing a product like that is high in sugar content and obviously not very healthy, like chocolate. How do we market those, and is it ethical to market chocolate bars to children, where you have an advert where there's this kid who's eating a chocolate bar and he's having the time of his life because he's getting all the sugar high, and then that kid's bugging his parents to buy him a chocolate bar, which is obviously having a massive impact on health issues in the UK, especially childhood obesity and just obesity in general as well. To what extent is it ethical for a business to be advertising and targeting those kids? Maybe it goes in the same way that alcohol and cigarettes have over the last few years, where the adverts have had to be a bit more conscious of the impact they're having on maybe not always vulnerable groups, but on people who we're all watching adverts, so we all see it. So maybe it's going to go in the same way. So I think it's worth just making sure you're aware of the impact of ethics on marketing and ethics on people management when you're considering when you're doing your preparation for this exam, because there might be a link between, that's a clear link between theme 1 content and theme 4 content. So hopefully there's a little bit of help there. I've talked for about 40 minutes or so hopefully just as a sort of quick 35-40 minute video to watch maybe a couple of hours before the exam or before you go in, especially that start bit, the bit at the beginning where I was talking about the structure of the papers and how to structure your arguments, that first sort of 10-15 minutes. If that just reminds you to do one thing in the paper, and that one thing helps you get a couple of extra marks, maybe it's using a quote, maybe it's structuring your paragraphs the right way and making sure you've got a conclusion and make sure you've recommended in a 20 marker, that might make all the difference, in which case it was well worth me sitting here for 40 minutes and recording it. So if you do have any questions, you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter is Mr. J Goodrich. It'll be the same as this YouTube video. So feel free to jump on and ask any questions. I'll be about. And for my students, I'll be about period 3 tomorrow before the exam. So feel free to pop along. I should be in my classroom, and we'll go through some last minute things. All right, and good luck.